Walk away.
This
now.
doesn't concern you.
Doing Talos's work. Welcome back, ladies and gents, to Larks Lamentations, a series in which we take a faction and put them on trial to expose their flaws and theorize on how to fix them. So put on your horn helmets and get ready to guard your knees, because today we are venturing to Skyrim, as we put the Stormcloak Rebellion on trial. Okay, so first, a little Tamriel history. Okay, there's going to be a lot of lore involved today, so please bear with me. This is a whole lot of research. We go very in-depth here. But let's start off with the bare-bones basics. There are 9 provinces: Cyrodiil, Hammerfell, High Rock, Morrowind, Blackmarsh, Elsewhere, Valenwood, the Somerset Isles, and of course, Skyrim. Each province has their own indigenous people with their own culture. Throughout the history of the Elder Scrolls, there has been 3 notable empires: Alicia's, Raymond Cyrodiil's, and the last and most important, formed by Tiber Septim. So let's look at Tiber Septim, because he is very relevant to today's story. See, after Raymond's empire assumed room temperature and a few hundred years had passed, a guy named Talos showed up on the scene, serving the king of Falkreath in southern Skyrim. Talos proved to be both a great warrior and an excellent general. Then he got a message from the Greybeards saying, "Bro, you a dragonborn," which means he had the soul of a dragon, the blood of a dragon, and can kill people by yelling at them. Every drill sergeant's dream come true.
Ah! You don't scare me!
With this in mind, Talos' lord got really excited and decided to march down to the remains of the Imperial City and declare himself the new emperor of a new empire, becoming Emperor Zero, only to die by an assassin's blade on the first day.
Good job.
With that waste of space out of the way, Talos decided to change his name to a more Cyrodiilic name, Tiber Septim. And with a new scar across his throat, he started the Third Empire. Tiber Septim would then go on to become a combination of Alexander the Great and Caesar Augustus, as he brings every province in Tamriel under his control. Some came more willingly than others. Yeah, about the Somerset Isles. The home of the High Elves was the last to be included, and they had so many elves die in the conquest that Ysgramor and Perennial Whitestrake started blushing. I only bring this up because it was the first time an empire included all 9 provinces, and the High Elves got their asses kicked so hard 600 years later, they're still salty about it. Anyway, 400 years after Tiber Septim ascends to godhood, ask Hemsgeir for more details,
and I am his prophet.
Emperor Uriel Septim VII is assassinated. A literal dark god descends on Tamriel, and it is only stopped when Uriel's bastard son Martin fuses with Akatosh, the dragon god of time, to wreck his shit and save Tamriel. This, however, leaves Tamriel to deal with a now extinct Septim dynasty, with the subsequent power vacuum, and the provinces of Blackmarsh, Elsewhere, Valenwood, and the Somerset Isles broke off from the empire, becoming independent countries. Well, that's not great, but it could be worse. Oh, and the Somerset Isles have now been taken over by the Thalmor, who are an elven supremacist party that want to reform the Aldmeri Dominion, and they do, bringing Valenwood and Elsewhere under their control as well. Well, shit. Anyway, flash forward 30 years before the events of Skyrim, the Dominion gives an ultimatum to a newly crowned Titus Mede II, asking for the disbanding of the Emperor's bodyguards and espionage agency, the Blades. They also want the outlawing of the worship of Talos, Dominion annexation of Hammerfell, and regular tribute of gold to the Thalmor. Titus Mede obviously said no, and then the Dominion launched an all-out war into the Empire a few days later. This took the Empire completely by surprise, and they even succeeded in capturing the Imperial City. The Empire managed to take back the city, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Empire's army suffered so greatly that any further military action would be impossible. So with the great reluctance, Titus Mede II signed the White Gold Concordant, giving the Dominion everything they originally asked for, except the gold tribute. Needless to say, this was distasteful to the citizens of the Empire, but they begrudgingly accepted it considering the state they were in. However, this was unacceptable to the Nords of Skyrim.
Well, I call it blasphemy. A true son of the Empire would never have turned his back on our greatest hero.
Wait a couple years and about half of Skyrim is rebelling under the leadership of Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak, who rejects the treaty and vows to make Skyrim an independent kingdom, while the other half of Skyrim wants to remain loyal to the Empire, and thus a civil war between Empire loyalists, led by the Legion, and the Skyrim separatists, the Stormcloaks. Alright, now with the basics down, let's get something out of the way in the context of Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls series. The Stormcloaks are actually more harmful than helpful.
How dare you!
Come on, guys. You shouldn't be surprised since I'm putting the Stormcloaks on trial. That being said, unlike the Railroad in Fallout 4, I actually like the Stormcloaks.
That's bordering on treason, man!
Yes, I think they're wrong, and normally I fight against them, but I'd be lying if I said they were completely wrong. The Stormcloaks do have good reasons to be angry. I completely understand why they do what they do. This honestly adds a bit of unexpected realism to the fantastical setting, but ultimately the things that hurts the Stormcloaks as a whole is they fail to see the bigger picture around them. I imagine there are probably several pissed off Stormcloaks fans watching, but I ask you to please bear with me. In all seriousness, the Stormcloaks have a good deal going for them that appeal to many in the game and in real life: a desire for independence and self-rule, resisting religious persecution, and a leader who is voiced by a Czech demigod.
I suspect the gods have needs for you elsewhere. That said, some of the Legion's staunchest men have organized themselves.
In any other situation, they would be the obvious good guys. Sadly, for Ulfric, the situation isn't so cut and dry. One of the good things going for Skyrim Civil War storyline is that there is no clear-cut good guy or bad guy. Both factions have moral shortcomings, neither are perfect, which makes it much harder to choose a side when you understand the background of the world. Again, it adds a bit of realism. But because of this, there is a hot debate on which side to choose even 10 years after the game came out, both with good points, but for me, the Stormcloaks are by far the inferior choice, and we're going to see why they are not viable. First, let's take a look at their leader, Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak. To his followers, he is a virtuous freedom fighter.
Up to his legend, but he does. Every Nord should admire Ulfric. He fights for all of us.
To his enemies, a power-hungry traitor.
Because that's what traitorous cowards do when they desire power. Ulfric coveted the High King's throne. He thought he deserved it more than Torrig.
To me, I see a troubled man seated with the burden of rule, plagued by guilt and uncertainty. Ulfric's life is a sad one. Born as the only son of the Jarl of Eastmarch, he was selected by the Greybeards to train in the way of the voice. When the Great War broke out, he left to fight the Thalmor against the wishes of his Greybeard masters. Though he fought valiantly, he was captured by the Aldmeri Dominion during one of the battles around the Imperial City, and he was tortured for information. Though Ulfric resisted the horrors of the Thalmor, eventually it would be too much and they would break him. Upon cracking under the Thalmor's whip, Ulfric was led to believe the information he gave was vital to the Empire's defeat. Ulfric escaped captivity, a broken man. After the war ended, Ulfric returned home to find Skyrim filled with refugees, rebellious Forsworn, and a populace embittered by the White Gold Concordant. Ulfric, feeling his duty to his homeland, formed a militia out of old legionary veterans in Skyrim to destroy the Forsworn rebellion in the province of the Reach. After a successful campaign, Ulfric and his newly branded Stormcloaks captured Markarth, the capital of the region, and he issued an ultimatum of his own to the Imperial Relief Force that they should legalize the worship of Talos in Skyrim, or we're not giving the city back over to Imperial hands. With little other choice, the Imperial authorities agreed.
We became desperate. We promised a group of Nord militia free worship in exchange for their help retaking the hold.
Through his own exploits and leadership, Ulfric had gained the love of the people, and for the first time since he was chosen by the Greybeards, a sense of accomplishment. Sadly, the story doesn't end here. Shortly after Markarth was handed over, the Thalmor swooped in, accusing the Empire of breaking the treaty, and they forced the Imperials to reinstate the Talos ban and arrest Ulfric for breaking the treaty.
Then the Elves found out about it. We were forced to arrest all of them. Ulfric Stormcloak, their leader, used the whole thing as proof that the Empire had abandoned Skyrim.
From a prison cell, Ulfric would hear that his father had died. Ulfric was forced to lament that in his father's final hours, he was not by his side. All he could do was think on how he had failed. First he failed the Empire, then Skyrim, and now his own family. Ulfric was consumed by sorrow, and that sorrow festered and grew into rage. When he returned to Eastmarch, he found a populace broken and begging for change, and a leader that would give it to them. The newly crowned Jarl Ulfric would be that leader. He had to be, didn't he?
Finally set free, I returned to Windhelm and was greeted by a city in mourning, at one with my own grief and anger, clamoring in angry voices, calling out for justice, for war. They sat me on the throne of Ysgramor, the throne of my father. I only hope I can prove worthy of that honor.
As Jarl Ulfric campaigned against the Dominion, urging other Jarls to push for Skyrim's independence, with some Jarls even openly agreeing with him, finally, when High King Isolde died, the moot was called for the Jarls to vote on a new king. Despite Ulfric's passionate speeches and pleading for the moot to choose a king who would go for an independent Skyrim that would resist the White Gold Concordant, the moot decided on Isolde's son, Torrig, as the next High King. Ulfric chafed under this decision. Torrig was a boy. Worse, he was a puppet, an imperial puppet.
Between you and me, he wasn't even that good a king. All of those rambling speeches about the Empire this and the Empire that.
Ulfric had had enough. He went to Solitude and challenged Torrig to a duel. The young High King accepted the duel, and he readied himself for combat, and Ulfric shouted him down using the power of the voice. And while Torrig was knocked down, he ran him through with his sword. Although technically this was not illegal, the use of a shout in a duel had not been done in centuries. The Empire and half of Skyrim viewed the duel as murder, and from there, Ulfric was forced to flee Solitude back to Eastmarch. There would be no turning back. Skyrim was now divided between Imperial and Stormcloak. The sons of Skyrim would now shed their own blood. Honestly, I feel for Ulfric. He's only trying to do what he believes is best for his people, and at every turn his actions lead to disaster. When the player goes into the Palace of Kings, quite often you'll see Ulfric question his cause in the war.
I fear still need convincing.
Then let them die with their false kings.
We've been soldiers a long time. We know the price of freedom. But people are still weighing things in their hearts.
What's left of Skyrim to wager?
They have families to think of.
The deaths of his people and the consequences of the war weigh heavily on his mind. He's not the selfish monster the Imperials think he is. Simply put, he's not evil, he's misguided. This is where the problems start. Ulfric is doubting his own cause and his own value as a leader. He hates the Thalmor and the White Gold Concordant, but is it worth destroying everything? Is it worth all the deaths it will take to get rid of the Empire and the Thalmor? Unfortunately, Ulfric can't have any true reflection on this, because that would mean giving up his own right hand, Galmar Stonefist. Galmar constantly goads Ulfric towards war. Anytime Ulfric shows any sign of contemplation or regret, Galmar completely dismisses these notions and urges Ulfric towards war and violence. Throughout the interactions with Ulfric, I got the impression most of Ulfric's plan and desires came from Galmar pushing him in the wrong direction.
How long are you going to wait?
You think I need to send Bolgraf a stronger message?
If by message you mean shoving a sword through his gullet, I still say you should take them all out like you did dead King Torrig.
Perhaps if Galmar hadn't been there, and he hadn't constantly been nagging at Ulfric's ear, he may have found another less blunt way to deal with his problems. Maybe he wouldn't have killed Torrig. Maybe he wouldn't have made the demands after the Markarth incident. A shame we will never know. Despite Ulfric's misgivings, he is sure of one thing: tradition, as are the rest of the Stormcloaks. They long for a time when Skyrim was independent and only for Nords and Nordic culture. Thus, this is what we will focus on next: their culture. Skyrim and the Nords have a long and proud history, and they aren't afraid to tell you about it.
Why, you puffed up ignorant. These are our sacred traditions that go back to the founding of the First Empire.
Sadly, the Stormcloak's strict adherence to it is only a hindrance. For example, most Nords in Skyrim care little for magic unless it's the School of Restoration. But few Nords are practitioners. To put that into perspective, of the 6 court mages in Skyrim, only 2 are actually Nords. Well, actually, only 1 we know of. One's classified as Elder, so we can't really tell. In general, Nords look down on magic.
Magic is shunned by most. If it can't be swung over your head and used to crack skulls, most Nords want nothing to do with it. Magic is seen as something for elves and weaker races.
Considering that the Stormcloaks have precious few resources, it would be in their best interest to find some mages who could bolster their limited forces with enchantment or healing, or better yet, a wizard casting alteration spells on their allies to increase their stats. This would at least make up for their lack of heavy armor. Yet it would seem for a proper Nord, and therefore the Stormcloaks, they don't need any city-weak magic. Speaking of silly, you might have heard the rallying cry,
Skyrim belongs to the Nords!
Yeah, that's not just a rallying cry, it's a worldview. And it's also a bit of a problem. Now. I can already feel several of your eyes rolling. Oh boy, here we go, another Stormcloaks are racist argument. I promise I won't go the way you're thinking. Truth be told, the Stormcloaks actually aren't all that racist. I mean, look at them. They will let literally any race join their ranks, and though they are suspicious of outsiders, once they get to know you, and they realize that you're no harm, they'll leave you alone. In fact, they'll be quite fast friends. You even get bonus points if you're willing to adapt your lifestyle to theirs.
It was difficult at first. The Nords of this city are at best suspicious of outsiders. But in time, I made the right friends and proved myself useful enough that they don't give me trouble anymore.
The issue is their reluctance to accept and work with outsiders unless the outsiders make the effort first. While this isn't abnormal for a pre-modern society, honestly, it's pretty standard, it's still a problem because it limits their recruiting pool and makes forming any potential alliance next to impossible. While Nords make up the vast majority in Skyrim, there are other groups that call it home. Let's look at one group in particular, the Dark Elves in Windhelm. The Dark Elves live in slums and they have resentment for their Stormcloaks ruling over them because all problems seem to be ignored by Ulfric.
Sir, there continues to be unrest in the Grey Quarter.
Blast to Dark Elves. I don't suppose you could tell them that I presently have larger concerns, such as all of Skyrim.
They don't seem to be very sympathetic to our cause, sir.
Let me know if you hear anything more substantial.
Of course, my lord.
While I find the notion of Dark Elves complaining about racism hilarious, considering they were the biggest slavers in Tamriel, and with a particular preference for Argonian slaves, someone read a specific book, the problem still stands. The Dark Elves hate the Nords because they won't help them, and the Nords hate the Dark Elves because they won't help them in the war effort. If one side would just be willing to make the first move, the other might warm up to the other, but neither are willing to do that. But this goes beyond just Dark Elves. Take our curved sword-toting friends from Hammerfell. For some reason, the Nords can't stand these guys, and this is a massive shock to me. Hammerfell is one of the few places where the Aldmeri Dominion are actually having trouble. Hammerfell actually beat the Dominion out of their lands. The Stormcloaks should be trading notes with the Alec here, not giving them the stink eye.
Skyrim didn't have enough outsiders. Now we got mercenaries from Hammerfell strutting about.
This will be a major problem if Skyrim becomes an independent nation. If they truly want to pose a threat to the Aldmeri Dominion, they are going to need allies. Hammerfell would be the most logical choice as they are also a newly built independent nation that hates the Thalmor just as much as they do, and they would also benefit from the alliance, but the way the Nords act, diplomacy will be next to impossible. The Nords may be a hardy bunch, but they're going to need more than light armor and a go-get-em attitude to beat the Thalmor, or anyone, really. Speaking of fighting, the Stormcloaks don't show any capacity to beat any enemy, let alone the superpower that is the Aldmeri Dominion. The only way the Stormcloaks have a chance of winning the Civil War is if the Dragonborn chooses to side with them. Now, I know some of you might argue that the same could be said of the Legion, but I want to remind you that at the beginning of the game, the Legion had pretty much won. The head of the Imperial Legion in Skyrim, General Tullius, was able to successfully ambush and capture Ulfric and he and his entire officer corps. They were only saved by a literal world-ending dragon showing up out of the ether.
Sentries, what do you see? It's in the clouds.
That's right, General Tullius shows up in Skyrim and almost immediately crushes the rebellion. This does not bode well for the Stormcloak strategy. In a few cases, we can actually get to look at the full-on Stormcloak strategy and tactics. We can't really say much good. Take the Battle of Whiterun, for example. They have catapults and decide to load them with fire to set the city ablaze so the defenders will be busy fighting the fires rather than defending the gate. This seems like an okay plan, but it really doesn't seem to distract the guards too much. In fact, they really don't let the plan work at all. They don't wait for the fire to actually set up on any of the buildings. They just launch a few fire pots and they just decide to go for the gate. Why not instead use the catapults you have and take the already crumbling walls down? Make multiple holes in the wall so the defenders can't bottleneck you. I guess Galmar not only has stones for fists, but rocks for brains. I'd also like to mention you have a very notable family that are Stormcloak sympathizers in Whiterun. They're actually just waiting to take over if you side with them. Why don't you have these guys perform some acts of sabotage or something? Would have been much better than starting to burn a city only to bum rush into a choke point in front of the city gate. Also, I love the catapults, guys. Never use them on any forts you have to capture later on. Great use of resources, boys. Okay, while their combat is questionable, their strategy off-battlefield leaves much to be desired as well. If the Stormcloaks capture Solitude and end the war, Ulfric leaves Jarl Elsif not only alive, but in power.
Will she acknowledge that it is we Nords who will determine Skyrim's future? Will she swear fealty to me, so all may know that we are at peace and a new day has dawned?
I do.
Then it is settled. The Jarl will continue to rule Solitude. I will garrison armies here to ward off Imperial attempts to reclaim the city.
The woman who he himself widowed and has a claim to the High King's throne was just left alone in full power with the assurance that, she just won't fight back. I promise. Honest. Oh, and all the other displaced Jarls are just chilling in her court. And no one seems to think this is a problem. In fact, they call it a masterstroke. Fine, I guess I'll point out the obvious. Ulfric, you silly goose, you've just created a recipe for a rebellion of your own. Now, I know what you're thinking, but the Stormcloaks are garrisoning the city. Lark, how can they possibly rebel? Simple. Wait for or create a situation where the Stormcloak army has to be called away and large parts of the garrisons have to be a part of that army to put out whatever fire. While the garrison is weakened, they can throw a coup and revolt. Also bear in mind, Solitude borders next to High Rock, an Imperial province, so if they act quickly, Imperial reinforcements could come and help retake the city. But even then, the smart thing to do would have been to choose a new, loyal Jarl for Solitude and have Elisif under house arrest in Windhelm, where she is away from her power base. But with that out of the way, let's discuss another massive issue the Stormcloaks face: geography and logistics. Take that gun barrel out of your mouth right now, young man. I promise this is important. Now, unlike most of the problems listed thus far, the Stormcloaks can't help their location, so I won't fault them too much, but these are points that still need to be considered. Think about the holds that the rebellion actually starts with: Eastmarch, the Rift, Winterhold, and the Pale. These locations have only one real advantage: they are well suited to guerrilla warfare, and thus favor the defenders. But as far as supplying and equipping an organized standing army, we have some problems. First off, the only holds that have decent-sized populations to recruit soldiers from, and as a workforce to drive the economy, the only holds that can do that are Eastmarch and the Rift. Winterhold is a barren wasteland, Ulfric himself admits it, and the Pale has a small population, with its only benefit being its mines and its small port at Dawnstar. The problem is, the only real place that Dawnstar can trade with would be Windhelm, Blackmarsh, and Morrowind. However, with the way the Nords interact with Argonians, I can't imagine they would be too happy to trade, and Morrowind is still recovering from a massive volcanic eruption / lizard slave invasion, and thus they aren't ready or really a great place to trade. Now, but what about the other side of Tamriel? Well, High Rock is, like I said previously, is under Imperial control and would not welcome them, and to get anywhere else they would have to go around High Rock, which is just an invitation to get hit by the Imperial Navy. Effectively, the only real thing that the port can do is supply Stormcloaks and Windhelm with iron ore and fish, the latter of which will be incredibly important because the only hold in Stormcloak control that can reliably provide agriculture is the Rift. The Pale and Winterhold are tundras unsuited for farming, and most of Eastmarch's territory is filled with geysers and swamps. What's worse is, even the Rift can't be relied upon heavily considering the corrupt nature of Riften politics and the incapability of Riften's Jarl. Whiterun was an important goal in Ulfric's conquest, not just because of its central location, but because of its access to farmland.
Hinge on Whiterun. If we can take the city without bloodshed, all the better, but if not...
Which Stormcloaks desperately need. Even without an offensive Imperial campaign, the Stormcloaks would be on borrowed time as their resources dwindle. This is a problem the Empire doesn't have. It's much larger, and even if you find problems with the Imperial holds, they still have resources in Cyrodiil and in High Rock that they can ship in. The only way the Stormcloaks are getting any help would be from a mysterious benefactor. Now let's talk about the pointy-eared elephant in the room. Time to mention the real enemy of Skyrim, the fucking Thalmor.
Damn elves. I bet they had something to do with this.
This whole mess is rooted in the Thalmor and their damn treaty, and the Stormcloaks dream of getting back at the Aldmeri Dominion for daring to tell them what to do. They even themselves admit the elves are the real enemy here. The Empire is just a stopgap. They need to get through the Empire. Once they get through the Empire, they can get to the Dominion. So, how do they plan on doing that? Simple. By doing literally everything the Thalmor could possibly want. Wait, what? Okay, let's look at this. Rebelling against the Empire is exactly what the Thalmor wanted, and their embassy, they prove it. They have Ulfric Stormcloak listed as an asset. I think Ulfric would lose his shit if he knew this, but like it or not, he is. Want to know why Elenwen was at Helgen? It wasn't because she was helping the Empire. It was because she wanted to find a way to spring Ulfric before he became a head lighter. That's why the execution was so rushed at Helgen. Tullius knew that Elenwen was planning to spring him. Now, don't get it twisted. The Thalmor don't want a Stormcloak victory. They just want the civil war to go on as long as possible to drain resources from an already weakened empire. Still, given the option between the two, the Thalmor would much prefer a Stormcloak victory over an Imperial one. Still, by their own admission, Ulfric and Galmar haven't forgotten who the real enemy is. Let's say you take over Skyrim, it's its own independent kingdom. What's the plan to strike back at those elven bastards?
Of course, we'll be taking the fight to the Elves soon enough. We'll need trained, disciplined, and creative warriors ready for all that.
Really? Guys? That's your plan? Jump on a boat and sail down to the Somerset Isles and hope for the best? If it were that easy, the Empire wouldn't have lost the First Great War. Not to mention, Skyrim is thousands of miles away from any Dominion territory, and as stated before, you have no allies. How are you going to supply the men and the ships? What places are you going to attack? How are you going to get past or destroy their defenses? How are you going to succeed where the much larger and better equipped Empire failed? I'd like to remind you that it took Talos himself, a united empire, in a fucking dwarven mecca to put the Somerset Isles into submission. But you're gonna do it with a bunch of pissed off Nords? Listen, the Nords are skilled warriors and make decent shock troops, but that's about it. The Aldmeri Dominion has talented warriors themselves, along with the best archers in Tamriel, the Wood Elves, some of the best scouts in the Khajiit, who I might also mention, depending on the moons in the sky, can breed giant battle cats, and let's not forget the best mages in Tamriel with the High Elves. Compare that to the 0 wizards you have. That's not a recipe for success, and by your own admission, Skyrim needs time to recover after the Civil War.
The new Jarls need help building armies and enforcing their right to rule, during which we must rebuild Skyrim into the land it once was. Strong, self-reliant, the center of mankind.
You are not in the state to go on an offensive campaign. I'm sorry, but I don't think this will end well for you. Now, I know some of you are thinking, hey, hold on, champ. An offensive campaign against the Thalmor is perhaps unfeasible or unlikely, but with the Dragonborn, Skyrim is now safe from invasion. To which I say, you're correct.
I misjudged you.
Hey man, let's take a break from the negative and talk about one of the best things the Stormcloaks have going for them. You. Should you choose to ally with Ulfric, it becomes apparent to him that you are insanely useful and grants you the title of Stormblade and makes you a member of his own family.
You've become a true hero of Skyrim. I number you among my kin. You shall now be known as Stormblade. The love of the land and her people flows from your heart, even as death to her enemies flows from your hands.
Shucks, folks, I'm speechless.
Meaning that since Ulfric has no other relatives, your Dragonborn is next in line for the throne. Which is great! You get a sweet name and you are heir apparent for the throne of Skyrim. No Jarl in their right mind would vote against you. However, there is a catch. Oh, come on, you knew something this good wouldn't come up without a catch, right? Anyway, problem 1. Once the Dragonborn High King eventually dies, Skyrim is left exposed, and likely after his death, the Jarls will fight over who takes the High King's spot, leaving Skyrim prone to invasion. Keep in mind, a lot of people may not like the fact that the Imperials basically, their candidate always won, but at least it led to a steady line of succession. There was up until Ulfric came along, there was no question of who would take over next. Luckily, though, Problem 2 negates Problem 1, at least for the time being. The Thalmor have no intention of invading Skyrim. Yet. Yeah, I know the Imperials like to brag, they're the only ones keeping the Thalmor out of Skyrim, but the only reason the Thalmor have a presence in Skyrim is to screw over the Empire. With the Empire out of Skyrim, there is little reason for them to expend resources to try and take it. The Thalmor's next target is Cyrodiil, not Skyrim. The independence of Skyrim is a mean to an end. But more on that later. See, the thing is, the problem with the Stormcloak Rebellion is short-sightedness. The terms of the treaty may suck donkey dick, but the Empire isn't happy with the terms either. They are tolerating them until war breaks out again, and it will break out again. Every side admits it. In the meantime, Ulfric is an uncertain leader with limited resources and few diplomatic solutions. But let's say you decide to work with Ulfric. The Empire is driven out of Skyrim and he is hailed as High King. Well, congratulations! Tamriel is now screwed in more ways than you know. But before I open up that can of depression, let's take a look at what could have been. Let's look at how we could fix the Stormcloaks. And there are 3 possible ways to do this. First one, the Guerrilla Force. For those that are maximum screw elves mode, instead of forming a rebel army to fight for an independent Skyrim, Ulfric decides it's a good idea to form the Stormcloaks to act as an anti-Thalmor organization that spends their time attacking and countering Aldmeri forces in Skyrim and abroad. While the Empire would officially be forced to label them as criminals, they could work together to weaken the Thalmor and their agenda. Just think how grateful Hammerfell would have been if, during their war to drive the Dominion out, a few Nordic war bands showed up to help aid them in certain locations. This would go greatly to improve Ulfric's standing with pretty much every nation. But let's look at some other options, which might be in more line with Ulfric's character. The Hammerfell Alliance. Let's say Ulfric liberates Skyrim and takes a look at Hammerfell and decides to know, you know what? Instead of just rejecting any outsider almost instantaneously because I'm too busy to look at it, let's say he takes a look at Hammerfell and says, hey man, you guys beat the shit out of the Thalmor and survived a civil war as well. Let's be friends. Skyrim and Hammerfell then form a mutual defense pact agreeing to assist any nation that gets attacked by the Aldmeri Dominion.
You son of a bitch.
This would work great. I have no doubt Hammerfell would be willing to agree to it. All in all, great plan. But sadly, like I said, the diplomatic situation in Skyrim does not leave much hope for the Stormcloaks. But we are talking about what could have been, not what is. And lastly, the Ebonheart Pact. Some of you just perked up at this one. Little background for this one. During the Second Era, there was an interregnum period after Raymond Cyrodiil's empire ended. The Daedric prince Molag Bal tried to take over Tamriel using the Cult of Worms, and Cyrodiil descended into chaos. You know, if I had a nickel for every time a Daedric prince tried to take over Tamriel, through a cult, I'd have 2 nickels. That's not a lot, but it's still a surprise it's happened twice. Regardless, during the chaos, multiple countries formed an alliance, one of which was the Ebonheart Pact, which included Blackmarsh, Morrowind, and Skyrim. If Ulfric had decided to use his political sway to help the Dark Elves and Argonians in his hold, and use that to build good relations with the remains of Morrowind and the newly expanded Argonian territories, Ulfric could have reformed the Ebonheart Pact and thus created a new superpower large enough to threaten the Aldmeri Dominion. This would be a great situation to have, because now you have three large powers in Tamriel. You have the Aldmeri Dominion, the Ebonheart Pact, and the remains of the Tamriel Empire. All in all, this would be a very interesting way to spice things up. But sadly, Morrowind is still recovering, and the way that the Nords and Argonians treat each other, in the actual lore right now, this is unlikely to happen. But with those options unfeasible, and the Stormcloaks they are in their current state, I'm afraid the Stormcloaks are still, overall, the worst choice to make. If the Dragonborn sides with Ulfric, then Tamriel will be all but destroyed. With Skyrim's independence, the Empire is left with High Rock and Cyrodiil. Through the Empire's losses and direct connection cut off, the legions will be unable to hold on to the Breton homeland, and High Rock will break off from the Empire, fragmenting back into 100 warring Breton kingdoms, leaving Cyrodiil weak and isolated. Its armies in ruins, and its emperor dead. The Aldmeri Dominion will launch a new invasion into Cyrodiil and face little opposition. The Empire will fall, and for the first time since the Mythic era, the heartland of Tamriel will be under the control of black-hearted elves. From a conquered empire, the Aldmeri Dominion will use Cyrodiil as a staging area for future invasions into Hammerfell, then High Rock, and then, when the Dragonborn High King finally dies, Skyrim will fall next. Ulfric's legacy will not be that of a valiant hero who saved Skyrim from oppression, but a fool who secured humanity's damnation, thus entering Tamriel into a new, dark age. But there is another choice. A better choice.